Hey, I'm Shane. Today I'm going to be talking about the Sony A6600. This is currently Sony's flagship crop sensor camera and is the culmination of the A6000 series, while also borrowing a few elements from the A7 and the A9 series, and kind of making a very solid all-around crop sensor camera. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of the camera and who, in my opinion, this camera is actually made for. Before I dive into the review though, I'll talk about why I actually bought this camera. I'm a part-time photographer and videographer, and I mainly shoot on two Sony full-frame cameras, the Sony A7R III and the A7 III. And I use them for pretty much all my work. But I needed a third body for when I needed a locked-off camera at a wedding or for interviews. And I also want a camera that I could kind of just walk around with, because currently taking an A7R III out just for casual photography is quite overkill. So this is just a nice smaller size that I can take with me when I'm going out with my family or something, and I want a small photo or video camera. Before I get too granular with the review, I'll start off with all the key features. The most important thing this camera has is a 24 megapixel cropped sensor, which is APS-C size. And it's the same sensor that's found in all the other cameras in Sony's A6000 lineup. And it's a very competent sensor, though it is a little bit older. It is image stabilized, which is awesome for low light photography and video. And it also has a new display, which is fully articulating now, which is very nice. It can't go to the side, it actually goes to the top like this, which makes it awesome though when you want to get video of yourself or photos of you with friends, and it's very handy for that. The other very nice thing in this camera is the autofocus system. It is insanely fast, like insanely fast, and it locks onto subjects faster than you can think about it, which is awesome for just casual photography, but it's also super reliable for professional video. The last and most important feature in my opinion is the new battery. This camera has the Sony Z-type battery, which is the same battery that's found in Sony's full-frame cameras, and it lasts forever, especially in a crop sensor camera like this. It does very well and can easily last you through a day. Okay, now it's time to get granular, and I'll start off with the body. If you used any other camera in the Sony A6000 lineup, this is going to feel very familiar. It's very compact and small with one key notable change, and that is the larger grip size. This is to accommodate the larger battery, and it actually makes the camera a lot easier to use because it doesn't change the footprint, because as long as you have a lens mounted to the camera, it's going to be functionally the same size, but it makes it easier to grip with your hand. With that said, it's still not the most comfortable camera to hold if you have larger hands like myself, and you always have to kind of have your pinky sitting at the bottom unless you do have a grip attached to it or have the camera in a cage or something like that. Then it's a little bit easier to hold actually. The materials of the body are made out of Sony's familiar magnesium alloy, which is both very lightweight and very rugged. I've never had an issue with a camera made out of this material by Sony crack before, and it is very scratch resistant as well. Sony does say that the camera is weather sealed, though I haven't put this to the test extensively besides taking it out in a light drizzle. And quite frankly, I don't trust it too much just because there are still ports. There is no rubber gasket on the side port, nor on the battery bay, which just make me not terribly comfortable getting it wet. If you used any other camera in the Sony A6000 lineup, this camera's button layout is also going to be very familiar to you, with the notable addition of a C1 button and a C2 button on the top, which is very convenient, and I fully utilize those. On the back of the camera, there's also a couple more customized buttons, and realistically in the Sony menu system, you can change all of these to be whatever you want, which is very handy obviously. The most annoying thing though is that you'll notice there's a control wheel at the top and then the control wheel at the bottom. There is no front dial, which makes this camera extremely hard to work with when you're taking photos in fully manual mode, which I find is a very strange omission because compared to other similarly priced cameras in the APS-C kind of world, like from Fuji, there's a whole heck of a lot more controls on them, and the cameras are a lot easier to use because of that, which makes me confused why Sony decided to omit a front dial on this camera. On the topic of peculiar choices though, I'll talk about the ports, because Sony went with a couple weird options. They did add a headphone in and out jack, which is crucial for professional video work and is awesome that they have it on this camera. They have a micro HDMI port, which is very much so okay. I can't imagine them fitting anything larger on a body this size, but they went with a micro USB port, which was really annoying because taking files on and off of this camera is very difficult because you cannot go very fast through USB type 2 and it's just really slow. And the annoying thing too is that it's UHS type 1 SD card slot in here, which is very competent and can keep up with the recording speeds, but it is notable because it just takes forever to take files on and off this camera, and a faster card would have been very appreciated. Both of these aren't deal-breaking options, but they're just strange choices by Sony, which make using the camera just a little bit frustrating. I'll move on to the displays though, and really there's nothing to write home here about. They're just very competent. The electronic viewfinder is a tad bit dull, though it does have a very good refresh rate, making it easy to use when you're trying to just get focus on something in bright daylight, but you're not going to be able to pull manual focus that easily with it. With that said though, the back display is superb, and in bright daylight, it works fine. I find the colors are actually surprisingly accurate, and I like it much better than the display on the A7 III. The caveat to all this is, it is still the same 16:9 aspect ratio, which is great for video, but not so great for photos. And you do feel like you're missing out on real estate because the electronic viewfinder takes up so much space here that the back display just kind of feels a little cramped, and it's hard to, again, pull focus manually on this display. The real standout feature though with this camera is that the screen is now fully articulating, which is awesome if you're a vlogger, but even just for casual use. For instance, if I'm with my nephews and I want to get a photo of us as a group, and obviously they can't hold the camera, so having the camera in the selfie mode is very convenient for that. And even just for taking landscape photos, it's quite handy because you can hold the camera at such a low angle that you can look up now. The only catch is that it would have been nice if the camera could flip out, like the display could flip out like other ones do to the side, because then you could take portrait stuff while at a low angle. But it's funny because all the new cameras Sony are coming out with have that different style of articulation, so it is what it is. The biggest drawback is when you do have the display up like this, accessing the hot shoe for a microphone is almost impossible because it obstructs the whole display. So what you need to do is get a third-party adapter to move it over to the side or the front and have it so that you can use a microphone still. I actually just use a camera cage which has 2 cold shoes on either side, and that way I can attach a monitor to this or a couple microphones if I wanted to. And I find that's the workaround that works best for me. But it's just not ideal, but I'm happy that it's there as a feature. I'll move on now to the software, and I'll start off with the menu system, which is the same menu system Sony has used for years, and it's just not great. There's nothing to write home about here. There's just a lot of buttons. None of it's touch enabled, so you cannot slide through the menus or scroll or do anything that you'd want to do when you have a touch display, even though this camera does have a touch screen. It's only useful for if you want to take photos and if you want to tap on an area and focus. It's very good at that, but the touch functionality is quite limited. It is good to see that Sony's newer cameras have new software in them, like the Sony A7S III, but I wouldn't expect that they'd update this camera with that software. I'll move on to the good part of the software now, and that is the autofocus, because the autofocus in this camera is ludicrous. Sony always has had good autofocus for a few years now, but in their latest iterations, it's just gotten insanely good. This camera can find eyeballs of both people and animals very easily, and once it finds a spot it wants to autofocus to, it can lock onto that spot and hold it so well, making it an incredibly powerful tool for when you want to have more automation to your camera with that level of quality, such as a shallow depth of field or using a telephoto lens. This camera can absolutely push lenses to their full potential, which is lovely to use. In video, the autofocus is just as high performing. It can be as responsive or as smooth as you like. And the nice thing is you have control over that. even though it is autofocus, it does feel very natural still, and I use it all the time for my videos, and I'm very happy with it. With regards to image quality, it's no surprise that this camera is not going to be a major upgrade from other cameras in the series because it has the same sensor. It's a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor that can easily shoot in a lot of different settings. It has a great dynamic range, can easily shoot up to ISO 6400 without the image falling apart, and it also has image stabilization, which is a great feature for low light photography, even because you can get your shutter speed much slower, allowing you to get a lot more light than you would have otherwise. But if you're going to be doing still life, or if you're going to be blowing up portraits really large or landscapes, this camera just doesn't have the resolution to push those images that hard. It's great for casual street photography, family photography, and just everyday use, and it can really get you by, but it's not going to be pushing you to that really high-end professional, and that's obvious because that's not what this camera is designed for. What this camera is designed for is video work, and the primary focus of it is as a small video camera. And Sony did a great job in kind of putting in all the features that you'd expect, but it doesn't really push any boundaries. It shoots in an 8-bit 420 file size, which is okay. It's very familiar if you used any other Sony camera before, and you can shoot an S-Log 2 quite easily and get a decent dynamic range, but it's not a 10-bit video or a 422 color space, which would be nice, but it is what it is. That's what we got with this camera. It does shoot in 4K 30 if you want, but with a slight crop, but it can shoot in 4K 24 in the Super 35 mode, which is the whole sensor. The other nice feature is that it can shoot in 120 frames per second in 1080p with surprisingly high quality if you want slow motion in full HD. There is notably no 4K 60 frames per second with this camera, which would have been a really nice feature to see. However, it is an older board inside this camera and it probably just couldn't support it. The really nice thing though is that there is no record limits on this camera, and I've never had it overheat. And I've shot in like full sun for over an hour on a wedding day with the camera just locked off, and it just shoots one massive file that I can edit and post, and I don't need to worry about stitching files together or worrying about the camera shutting off because of overheating or hitting a record limit. The battery is the only limiting factor with this camera, and the battery is great. So even though it doesn't push any boundaries, this camera is just super reliable and super good at what it does. And even though the files are a little bit dated, the quality is still very high, and it's very easy for professional work to use it still. And as I said, the autofocus performance is just so good, and I've actually used it for the last few YouTube videos I've made as either my A camera or my B camera, and it just does super well, and I've been really happy using it. This is editing Shane. I realized after recording this video, I forgot to record a section on rolling shutter because it's a very important issue with this camera. And essentially what rolling shutter is the way the sensor reads data while recording video. And having bad rolling shutter will have vertical lines appear to be at a slant while moving the camera quickly from left to right, because the sensor is actually reading the information slower than you're moving the camera. This can become an issue in situations where there's a lot of action and the camera is moving quickly, or even in mundane situations like walking down the aisle during a wedding. Things at the edge of the frame can have strange distortion and an almost jello-like appearance. This camera is not alone in having this issue, and quite honestly, most DSLRs and mirrorless cameras suffer from bad rolling shutter, and it's just inherent in photography cameras being used for video. However, it is quite prominent on this camera, and it definitely will become a limiting factor with more high-end production work. And even though you stabilize the camera as much as you cannot get rid of the rolling shutter. And the best way to actually get rid of it is just not to move the camera as much or as dramatically. A big appeal of Sony cameras is their lens lineup, and Sony E-mount has had great adoption by both Sony themselves, and they have a lot of good options like the 16 to 55mm G lens, which I'm reviewing right now as well, and it'll be on screen now if you want to see that review. But Sigma makes great lenses, Tamron, Viltrox, there's just a lot of third-party adoption, which is awesome to see. And it makes this camera a great option for the fact that you can get a lot of really good value lenses for it, compared to other competitors on the market, which just have a smaller pool of lenses to pick from, especially Canon mounts. Like, no offense to the Canon system, but their APS-C cameras just don't have nearly the same amount of options that Sony does. At the end of the day though, what it comes down to is price. And this camera comes in at $1,200 US or 1,700 Canadian, which is quite expensive. And there's a lot of other great options on the market now in the APS-C kind of world, from Canon, Nikon, and Fuji, which all really compete with this camera. But I'm not gonna dive into them just because, again, there's so many options and I could spend a whole video talking about them. I am gonna compare this camera to two other options made by Sony though, specifically the A7C and the A6400, which I think compete with this camera the closest. Starting off with the A6400, which is another APS-C style camera with the same sensor, and the big differences is that it has the smaller battery again and the lack of in-body image stabilization. The A6400 comes in quite a bit cheaper at $900 US or 1,250 Canadian, which makes it a pretty good value compared to this camera, because even though it lacks image stabilization, which is, I think, the biggest key feature, making it harder to use for video work, it is a lot cheaper and you can get nice image stabilized lens for crop bodies that would kind of compensate for that. And regardless, the rolling shutter makes shooting any fast motion where image stabilization really comes into play difficult, because the rolling shutter becomes obstructive most of the time anyways. So you want to be on a tripod or somewhat stabilized in those situations regardless. So the A6400 is, in my opinion, a better camera if you're a new photographer. But if you know what you're looking for and you want all the maxed out features that the A6600 offers, that's going to be a better camera for you, and that's why I opted for it rather than the A6400. Even though realistically the A6400 fits my needs, the larger battery size is also a really nice thing to have, though not necessarily worth $300. When comparing the A6600 to the A7C though, the conversation gets a lot more interesting in my opinion, because the A7C just got announced by Sony and I haven't actually used it yet, but realistically, they're very similar cameras, but also very different. The A7C has the same sensor as the A7 III, but in the same body as the A6600, and has mostly everything else the same besides having a USB Type-C port on the side and better weather sealing, in a slightly larger body to accommodate the larger sensor. Otherwise, the mount is the same, the battery is the same, and the screen articulation, even though the A7C goes out to the side, it is also both capable of having selfie views. So the A7C comes in at $1,800 US or 2,300 Canadian though, which is even more expensive than the A6600 for a larger sensor, and realistically better low light performance and just overall better image quality. So you do get a lot more image quality benefits, but the thing is, you do lose out on the advantage of the small body with respects to the lenses, because full frame lenses inherently have to be larger to cover a full frame sensor, whereas lenses like this 16 to 55 are very compact, but make a lot more sense on this body type. Whereas if you're going to use the 24 to 70 GM for full frame, it is much larger and doesn't really sit as nicely on a body this size. So the compact factor that you get from having the A7C doesn't carry over as much as you might think. Even though the body is small, the lenses aren't yet. But in conclusion, I find the A6600 very interesting. I think it's a fantastic camera. The autofocus is awesome and the battery life is superb. And I actually enjoyed using this camera far more than I thought I would. However, I find there's a lot of very strange omissions Sony made, such as the lack of the front dial, the fact that there's no UHS Type 2 in it, and the lack of USB Type-C. And for it being its flagship APS-C camera, it's just not perfect when this technology is out there I don't know why Sony didn't include it in their flagship camera, but it kind of is what it is. For what the camera does, it does it really well. And if you're considering this camera and like the features I told you about appeal to you, I can recommend this camera to you. It's a great camera, it's awesome. But if it's gonna be your first camera and you're looking for just kind of performance, the A6400 or even a used A6000 makes more sense for a first camera still, just because you still get the same image quality, though the autofocus is going to be worse, the battery life's going to be worse. You'll save a ton of money because this camera just isn't a fantastic value. For myself, I see myself using this camera as my kind of B camera. It'll be in my backpack if I need a camera just to get video on a tripod, or if I need to get kind of B-roll of something. This camera absolutely is super competent, though it is never going to be a primary camera for myself just because the rolling shutter is too obstructive and it's just a little too unwieldy to use for professional photography without the front dial for my workflow. But that's going to be it for the video. Thank you very much for watching. I'm sorry I didn't come to as concise of an answer as I normally do with these videos. It's a very difficult camera to review, surprisingly so. But if you have any questions about it, please leave a comment below. I'd be more than happy to answer, and I will have this, I own this camera, so I'll have it, so I should be able to answer any questions that you have. If you enjoyed the video though, maybe consider subscribing to my channel and liking the video. It goes a long way and helps me make more videos like this. Anyways, thanks again for watching. I hope you have an awesome day. I'll see you in the next one.